The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Afghan compound as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her scope for the third time. Her hands were steady, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in the valley below. The Navy SEALs had been pinned down for over 2 hours, their extraction point compromised by enemy forces that seemed to know their every move. Sarah had earned her place as the team's designated marksman through years of relentless training and an almost supernatural ability to place shots exactly where they needed to go. Growing up on her grandfather's ranch in Montana, she had learned to shoot before she could properly tie her shoes. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran, had taught her that patience and precision were more valuable than speed and aggression. The mission had started like any other. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value target was meeting with local insurgent leaders in a remote village nestled between 2 mountain ranges. The SEALs were tasked with surveillance and possible capture, but things had gone sideways almost immediately upon insertion. Team leader Commander Sarah's scope revealed 3 technical vehicles approaching through the dust-choked valley road, each mounted with heavy machine guns and packed with armed insurgents. Behind them, 2 larger trucks carried what appeared to be mortar tubes and additional ammunition. The enemy wasn't just reinforcing their position, they were bringing enough firepower to turn the trapped SEALs into memory. Through her earpiece, she could hear the growing desperation in Commander Morrison's voice as he coordinated his team's defense. "We've got maybe 10 minutes of ammunition left at current rate of fire. Overwatch, I need options." Sarah studied the aftermath of the convoy destruction sent ripples of confusion through the insurgent forces that Sarah could observe from her elevated position. Enemy fighters who had been confidently executing a well-planned ambush were now scrambling to understand what had just happened. Their carefully coordinated assault had been shattered by what appeared to be a single shot from an impossible distance. Sarah knew she had perhaps 10 minutes before the enemy reorganized and began actively hunting her position. The muzzle flash from her rifle would have been visible to trained observers, and the insurgents were clearly experienced enough to triangulate her general location from the angle of impact on the convoy. Through her scope, she watched 3 separate groups of insurgents beginning to move through the rocky terrain toward her ridge. They were advancing tactically, using cover and concealment while maintaining communication with hand signals. These weren't panicked fighters. They were professionals adapting to an unexpected threat. Commander Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece with newfound confidence. "Overwatch, we're seeing movement toward your position. Multiple groups. Looks like they're trying to flank you from 3 directions." Sarah had already identified the approaching threats and was calculating her options. Remaining in her current position would allow her to continue providing cover for the SEALs, but it would also mean certain discovery and elimination by the converging enemy forces. Relocating would preserve her safety, but might leave Morrison's team vulnerable to renewed attack. The decision was made for her when her scope picked up movement in the valley below. The remaining insurgents from the original ambush positions were regrouping and preparing to resume their assault on the trapped SEALs. They had apparently decided that eliminating the sniper threat was secondary to completing their primary mission. Sarah counted at least 8 fighters moving into position with clear fields of fire on Morrison's location. Without immediate intervention, the SEALs would once again be pinned down and vulnerable to the mortars that had survived the convoy destruction. The next few minutes would require shooting of a precision and speed that pushed beyond the boundaries of what any sniper had ever achieved in combat. Sarah would have to eliminate multiple targets at varying distances while enemy forces closed in on her position from 3 directions. Her first target was an insurgent setting up a light machine gun approximately 600 meters away. The fighter was partially concealed behind a stone wall, with only his head and shoulders visible as he prepared to lay down suppressing fire on the SEALs. Sarah's shot caught him center mass just as he was lifting the weapon into position. The machine gun tumbled from his grasp and clattered uselessly down the rocky slope. Without pausing to observe the impact, Sarah was already tracking her second target, a mortar team that had found a position with indirect fire capability on Morrison's location. The gunner was adjusting elevation while his assistant prepared rounds for firing. The distance was over 700 meters, and both targets were moving constantly as they set up their weapon. Sarah would have to choose between the gunner and the assistant, knowing that whichever one survived would likely complete the mortar setup and begin raining high explosives on the trapped seals. Sarah chose the assistant, reasoning that the gunner would need time to train a replacement on the weapon system. Her shot found its mark just as the man was lifting a mortar round toward the tube. The explosive tumbled from his hands and rolled away from the position, forcing the surviving gunner to abandon his setup and pursue the critical ammunition. But even as she engaged the immediate threats to Morrison's team, Sarah could hear the approaching insurgents getting closer to her position. Radio chatter in local dialects indicated they had identified her ridge and were coordinating their approach to cut off all escape routes. Sarah made the tactical decision to relocate while maintaining pressure on the enemy forces below. Moving while shooting was one of the most difficult skills in sniper warfare, requiring precise timing and absolute confidence in one's abilities. She gathered her equipment and began moving along the ridge line toward a secondary position she had identified during her initial reconnaissance. As she moved, she kept her rifle ready and her scope scanning for targets of opportunity. The movement proved fortuitous when her new angle revealed 3 insurgents who had been concealed from her original position. They were setting up an ambush along the route Morrison's team would need to use for extraction, positioning themselves to eliminate the SEALs when they attempted to leave their defensive position. Sarah's next 3 shots came in rapid succession, each finding its target despite the awkward shooting position and her own movement between shots. The precision was so extraordinary that even she felt a moment of disbelief at what she had just accomplished. The psychological effect on the remaining insurgent forces was profound and immediate. Radio chatter shifted from tactical coordination to confused reports of impossible accuracy and supernatural marksmanship. Some fighters began suggesting that they were facing a legendary sniper whose abilities transcended normal human limitations. Commander Morrison's team took advantage of the enemy's growing demoralization to begin advancing toward their extraction point. The constant pressure Sarah had maintained on insurgent positions had created gaps in their defensive lines that the experienced SEALs could exploit. But Sarah knew the mission wasn't over yet. Intelligence reports had indicated the presence of a high-value target in the area, and her scope revealed a figure in distinctive clothing observing the battle from a fortified position approximately 1,000 meters away. The target was surrounded by bodyguards and positioned behind substantial cover that would deflect most rifle fire. The angle required to reach him was extremely narrow, requiring a shot through a gap in the fortifications that measured perhaps 8 inches in width. More challenging still, the distance was at the very limit of her weapon system's effective range. Environmental factors like wind speed, humidity, and air density would all affect bullet trajectory over such an extended flight path. A single miscalculation would result in the target's escape and the loss of critical intelligence value. Sarah studied the target through her scope, noting his movement patterns and the periodic gaps in cover created by his gestures and conversation with his subordinates. She would have one opportunity when he turned to point toward the valley below, exposing his profile for perhaps 3 seconds. The mathematics of the shot were staggering. Bullet drop over 1,000 meters would require significant elevation adjustment. Wind conditions at that distance would deflect the projectile substantially. The target's movement meant she would have to lead her aim by several feet to compensate for his position when the bullet arrived. Sarah had never attempted a shot at such distance under combat conditions. Military snipers typically engaged targets at ranges of 300 to 600 meters, where environmental factors were manageable and accuracy could be reasonably assured. What she was contemplating was more suited to precision shooting competitions than battlefield conditions. But, as she watched through her scope, Sarah realized this was the moment that would define not only the mission but her entire career as a sniper. The high-value target represented intelligence that could save countless lives and disrupt enemy operations for months to come. Sarah controlled her breathing and found the perfect balance point between her heartbeats. The world seemed to contract until nothing existed except the crosshairs, the target, and the precise calculations flowing through her mind. When the target turned to gesture toward the valley, exposing his profile exactly as she had anticipated, Sarah squeezed the trigger with the smooth confidence of absolute certainty. The bullet's flight time over 1,000 meters seemed to last forever, but through her scope, Sarah watched with satisfaction as her shot found its mark with devastating precision. The high-value target dropped immediately, and his bodyguards scrambled to provide aid while scanning the hills for threats they couldn't comprehend. The elimination of their leader proved to be the final blow to insurgent morale. Within minutes, the remaining fighters began withdrawing from their positions and disappearing into the mountainous terrain. The carefully planned ambush had been completely shattered by marksmanship that bordered on the legendary. Commander Morrison's voice came through her earpiece with obvious admiration and relief. "Overwatch, we are clear and moving to extraction." That was the most extraordinary shooting I have ever witnessed in 15 years of special operations. As Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared to move to the extraction point, she reflected on what had just occurred. She had demonstrated accuracy and tactical impact that went far beyond normal military capabilities. Word of her performance would spread throughout the special operations community, creating both opportunities and challenges she couldn't yet foresee. The mission was complete, but Sarah understood that her life as an anonymous sniper was over. She had just become a legend, whether she wanted that distinction or not. The impossible shots had saved Morrison's team and achieved mission objectives, but they had also revealed abilities that would reshape how the military thought about the role of precision marksmanship in modern warfare. Walking toward the extraction point through the Afghan mountains, Sarah Chun had no idea that she had just performed feats that would be studied and discussed by military historians for decades to come. She only knew that when everything seemed hopeless, her grandfather's lessons about patience and precision had proven more valuable than any amount of advanced technology or superior numbers. The legend of the sniper who could make impossible shots was born in those mountains, forged in the crucible of desperate combat, where failure meant death for 6 of America's finest warriors. It was a legend built not on luck or chance, but on a lifetime of preparation meeting the moment when ordinary skill simply wasn't enough. Convoy through her scope, her mind racing through possibilities that bordered on impossible. The lead vehicle's machine gunner would have a clear field of fire on the SEAL's position within 3 minutes. Once that gun opened up, Morrison's team would be pinned down completely while the mortars set up and began their deadly work. The convoy was moving single file along a narrow mountain road carved into the cliff face. To the right of the road was solid rock wall rising hundreds of feet. To the left was a sheer drop into a canyon that would mean certain death for anyone who went over the edge. Sarah's grandfather had once told her that sometimes the most impossible shot was the only one worth taking. Looking at the convoy, she began to understand what he meant. The lead vehicle carried a driver, gunner, and at least 4 additional fighters. Standard tactics would require her to eliminate the gunner first, then the driver, then work through the other vehicles. But with that approach, the remaining vehicles would scatter or take defensive positions, and she would never stop them all in time. Instead, Sarah focused her scope on something that made every instinct scream in protest: the front tire of the lead vehicle. Not to disable it, but to send the entire convoy tumbling into the canyon below. The physics were staggering. She would need to hit the tire at precisely the moment the vehicle was passing a specific point where the road curved along the cliff edge. The angle of impact would have to be perfect to cause the vehicle to lose control and careen into the following trucks. 1 degree off, and the vehicle might simply stop or skid to safety. Wind conditions at that distance were unpredictable, constantly shifting due to the canyon's geography. The target was moving at approximately 40 miles per hour, and she would have a window of perhaps 2 seconds when the shot would be viable. Sarah had never attempted anything remotely similar. Military snipers were trained to eliminate personnel targets with precision shots to center mass or headshots. Deliberately targeting vehicles for tactical crashes was the stuff of action movies, not real combat operations. But as she watched the convoy approach and heard the increasing desperation in Morrison's radio calls, Sarah realized conventional thinking had already failed. The enemy had superior numbers, positioning, and resources. Traditional sniper tactics couldn't level those odds fast enough to save the trapped SEALs. She began her calculations with mechanical precision, despite the seeming impossibility of the task. Distance to target, approximately 900 meters. Target speed, 18 meters per second. Wind conditions, variable, gusting from the southwest at estimated 8 to 12 miles per hour. Bullet travel time, approximately 1.2 seconds. The margin for error was essentially zero. If she missed, the convoy would reach Morrison's position with overwhelming firepower. If she hit but failed to achieve the desired result, she would alert the enemy to her position and lose the element of surprise completely. Sarah controlled her breathing and found the calm center that had served her throughout countless training exercises and combat situations. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. The rifle is just a tool, Sarah. The real weapon is your mind. Trust your instincts, and never take a shot unless you know it's going to count. Through her scope, she watched the lead vehicle navigate a series of switchbacks as it climbed toward the battlefield. In 30 seconds, it would reach the crucial curve where the road ran closest to the canyon edge. That would be her moment. Sarah placed the crosshairs slightly ahead of the front tire, compensating for the vehicle's movement and the bullet's travel time. Her finger found the trigger and applied the first stage of pressure, removing all slack from the mechanism. The world seemed to slow as the vehicle approached the designated point. Sarah could see the driver's face through the windshield, the gunners scanning the hills for threats, the fighters in the back checking their weapons in preparation for the assault. The crosshairs aligned perfectly as the vehicle entered the curve. Sarah's breathing stopped, her heartbeat seemed to pause, and every muscle in her body achieved perfect stillness. In that moment of absolute focus, she squeezed the trigger with smooth, steady pressure. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and, through her scope, Sarah watched the bullet's impact with fascination and horror. The front tire exploded in a shower of rubber and metal, sending the vehicle immediately into a violent skid toward the cliff edge. The driver fought desperately to regain control, but physics and momentum were against him. The vehicle's front end swung wide toward the canyon as the rear wheels lost traction on the loose gravel road surface. Sarah watched in stunned silence as the lead vehicle tilted past the point of no return and began its tumble into the canyon. The second vehicle, following too closely to stop, slammed into the falling truck and was dragged over the edge in a tangle of screaming metal and human voices. The third vehicle managed to stop just short of the cliff edge, but its position left it exposed and vulnerable on the narrow road. The remaining two trucks further back began trying to reverse, but the confined space made maneuvering impossible. Sarah quickly shifted her aim to the exposed third vehicle. The fighters were scrambling to dismount and find cover, but they had nowhere to go on the narrow road carved into the cliff face. Her next shot took out the driver before he could attempt to reverse. The second shot eliminated the gunner who was trying to swing his weapon toward the hills. The psychological impact on the surviving insurgents was immediate and devastating. They had watched 3 vehicles and over a dozen fighters disappear into the canyon in a matter of seconds, apparently due to a single impossibly accurate shot. The remaining fighters began abandoning their vehicles and scrambling for whatever cover they could find along the rocky cliff face. From her position, Sarah could see the insurgents in the original ambush positions turning their attention away from the trapped SEALs toward the hills where they believed the sniper attack had originated. The carefully coordinated assault was fragmenting into chaos as commanders tried to identify and respond to this new threat. Commander Morrison's voice came through her earpiece with barely contained excitement. "Overwatch, whatever you just did worked. The pressure's off us down here." They're scattered and confused. But Sarah knew the situation was far from resolved. The surviving insurgents still outnumbered Morrison's team, and once they recovered from the shock of losing the convoy, they would likely attempt to coordinate a new assault. The element of surprise that had served her so well was now gone, and the enemy would be actively hunting for her position. More critically, Sarah realized she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The precision and lethality she had displayed went beyond normal military capabilities. She had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to influence the battlefield through impossible shots, and that knowledge would have consequences extending far beyond this single mission. Through her scope, Sarah could see the remaining insurgents organizing into smaller groups and beginning to move through the terrain with renewed caution. Some were clearly trying to establish new positions to resume the attack on the SEALs, while others appeared to be moving toward the hills to hunt for her position. The immediate crisis had passed, but Sarah understood that the real test was just beginning. She had bought Morrison's team time and disrupted the enemy's plans, but now she would have to maintain that advantage against opponents who knew they were facing something extraordinary. As she prepared for the next phase of the engagement, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would change everything about how she saw herself and how others would see her. The impossible shot had worked, but it had also revealed abilities that even she didn't fully understand. The battle for survival was far from over, and the hardest choices still lay ahead. Jake Morrison crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, speaking urgently into his radio. His team of 6 elite operators was trapped in a courtyard surrounded by ancient buildings that provided perfect vantage points for enemy snipers. What should have been a routine reconnaissance mission had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The enemy had anticipated their arrival. Somehow, the insurgents had positioned themselves in the surrounding hills and rooftops, creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement impossible. Every time one of Morrison's men tried to advance or retreat, accurate rifle fire forced them back into cover. Sarah observed the battlefield through her high-powered scope from her position on a ridge nearly 800 meters away. She had been placed there as overwatch, meant to provide early warning and cover fire if needed. Now, she was the only thing standing between the trapped SEALs and complete disaster. Through her earpiece, she could hear the tension in Morrison's voice as he coordinated with base command. "We've got at least 12 shooters in elevated positions. They've got us boxed in tight. Every time we move, they light us up." The enemy fighters were well-trained and disciplined, not the usual ragtag group of insurgents the team typically encountered. Their movements were coordinated, their fire accurate and measured. They weren't spraying bullets wildly, but taking careful, aimed shots that kept the SEALs completely suppressed. Sarah began methodically identifying targets through her scope. The insurgents had chosen their positions well, using the natural terrain and building structures to minimize their exposure. Most snipers would struggle to get clear shots at such distances with so many obstacles, but Sarah had always been different. Her first target was a shooter positioned in a bell tower approximately 750 meters away. The man was barely visible, just the outline of his shoulder and part of his rifle barrel exposed. Sarah controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow as she entered the zone that had made her legendary among her peers. The rifle bucked slightly against her shoulder, and, through her scope, she watched the insurgent slump forward. The shot had found its mark perfectly, threading between stone blocks that would have deflected a shot even inches to either side. "Tango down, northwest tower," Sarah reported calmly into her microphone. Morrison's team immediately took advantage of the eliminated threat, shifting positions to gain better cover. But the enemy adapted quickly, and more rifle fire erupted from different positions. Sarah was already tracking her next target when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Moving between buildings in the distance, she spotted figures carrying what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenade launchers. The insurgents weren't just trying to pin down the SEALs, they were positioning themselves to eliminate them entirely. "Commander, you've got RPG teams moving to your northeast and southwest. They're trying to get angles on your position," Sarah transmitted urgently. Morrison's response was immediate and grim. "Copy that. How long before they're in position?" Sarah tracked the moving figures through her scope, calculating distances and movement patterns. 2 minutes, maybe 3 if we're lucky. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. The SEALs were trapped in a confined space with limited ammunition and no immediate backup. The enemy had superior numbers, better positioning, and now heavy weapons. Without intervention, Morrison's team would be overrun or destroyed within minutes. Sarah shifted her aim toward the RPG team, moving along a rocky outcropping to the northeast. The lead fighter was carrying the launcher, while a second man followed with additional rounds. They were moving carefully but purposefully, using the terrain to mask their approach. The shot would be extremely difficult. The target was moving, partially obscured by rocks, and at a distance that tested the limits of her equipment and abilities. Wind conditions were variable due to the mountain terrain, and she would have only one chance before the team realized they were being targeted and took cover. Sarah steadied her breathing and began her calculations. Wind speed, distance, target movement, bullet drop, dozens of variables processed through years of training and experience. Her finger found the trigger as she led the target, predicting where he would be when the bullet arrived. The rifle spoke again, and Sarah watched through her scope as the insurgent carrying the RPG launcher stumbled and fell. The weapon clattered down the rocky slope, disappearing into a crevice where it would be useless to the enemy. Northeast RPG team is down, she reported. But, even as she spoke, her scope picked up the second RPG team moving into position from the southwest. These fighters had learned from their comrades' fate and were moving more carefully, using better cover and concealment. Sarah realized with growing alarm that despite her efforts, the enemy still held overwhelming advantages. For every threat she eliminated, two more seemed to take its place. The insurgents had clearly planned this operation carefully, and they had resources the intelligence reports hadn't anticipated. Commander Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece, strained but determined. Overwatch, we're running low on ammunition. How many more shooters are you seeing up there? Sarah swept her scope across the surrounding terrain, counting muzzle flashes and movement. What she saw made her heart sink. At least 8 more confirmed positions, Commander, and I'm seeing more movement in the tree lines to the east. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Even with her exceptional marksmanship, Sarah couldn't eliminate threats fast enough to give the SEALs a clear path to safety. The enemy had superior numbers, advantageous positioning, and seemingly unlimited ammunition. As she watched through her scope, Sarah saw something that changed everything. Moving through the valley below, a convoy of vehicles was approaching the battlefield. More insurgents were arriving, and with them came the possibility of complete disaster for Morrison's team. The radio crackled with increasing urgency as the trapped SEALs reported their dwindling ammunition supplies and the approach of enemy reinforcements. Time was running out, and conventional tactics were proving inadequate against an enemy that had clearly prepared for exactly this type of engagement. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would define not only this mission but her entire career. She was about to attempt something that violated every rule of engagement and safety protocol she had ever learned, something so dangerous that failure would mean certain death for everyone involved. Looking through her scope at the approaching convoy, Sarah began planning the most audacious and risky shots of her life. She would have to trust in abilities that even she wasn't certain she possessed, pushing beyond the limits of what any sniper had ever attempted under combat conditions. The fate of 6 elite warriors now rested entirely on her ability to do the impossible. When the SEALs were outmatched, her accuracy made the difference.